Hi, so welcome to the first video in a series of videos that I'm going to put up where I'm going to describe my interpretation of what the different cognitive functions are and what they're doing. And I posted an intro video. I'd ask you to watch that first because it's got all the caveats and little nuances that I wanted to point out, especially since these are going to be short videos and I can't do that for every video. But, this is, again, just sort of my interpretation on what these functions do based off of watching all the videos out there, reading all the blog posts, or as many as I can, and the books, and just sort of coming up with my interpretation of how all these things work. So today, or this video, I'm going to start off with introverted thinking and what that cognitive function is doing. So introverted thinking, it really boils down to just engaging in formal logic, symbolic logic. So the classic if P then Q, right? So if I were to say all poodles are dogs and Barney is a poodle, then you can conclude that, using your formal logic system, using your introverted thinking, you can conclude that Barney is a poodle and therefore Barney's a dog. And then the other thing that you could do using formal logic is if I were to tell you Chester is not a dog, you can conclude that Chester is therefore not a poodle. Again, using your formal logic. So to me, that's what TI is doing. And then there's sort of breakdowns in TI where, you might have some sort of logical fallacy or something. It's still TI doing it, but just doing it maybe incorrectly, let's say. So, for example, I could say Barney is not a poodle, and therefore Barney is not a dog. Now, those of you who are engaging in your TI as you watch this, you'll notice the logical fallacy there. Just because Barney isn't a poodle doesn't mean he's not a dog. For example, Barney could be a golden retriever, or he could be a pit bull, right? So that would be a logical fallacy, to come up with that conclusion. On the flip side, I could say Chester is a dog, and therefore Chester is a poodle. And again, if you're using your TI, you'd be able to figure out the logical fallacy of that. Just because Chester is a dog doesn't necessarily mean he's a poodle. Chester, again, could be a golden retriever, or he could be a pit bull, or some other type of dog, right? So that's just sort of, the basic formal logic, things that computer programs and all that are largely based off of. And I would argue that's your introverted thinking, right? And there's other types of formal logic, formulas and processes, and your introverted thinking, what it's doing is it's building up it's doing a couple things. Number one, it's just taking in new information and checking whether or not it's valid, right? Whether or not it's just logically valid or logically consistent. For example, if I were to say, Barney is a dog, therefore Barney is a poodle, your TI is going to start, hopefully sending off signals and saying, no, that's not necessarily a valid argument. It could be true, but it's not necessarily true, right? And so as you're doing that through your life, through different experiences and having different propositions and different conditions and different sort of statements and observations about the world, and coming into your introverted thinking model, you're building up this sort of logical model, this sort of logical representation of how the world works, right? And if you think of it in evolutionary biology terms, which I tend to do, you could see why the brain would develop this sort of system, right? So for example, if you're a hunter-gatherer and you're walking along in the forest and you see something red, your logical system might say, okay, most red things are edible and have some sort of benefit to it, but it doesn't necessarily mean all of them do, right? And so you don't want a system like what introverted feeling will be when I do my video about that. You don't want a system that's just based off of, this thing is good, versus this thing is bad. You want to be able to engage in some sort of symbolic, logical process to develop as precise of a model of the world as possible, right? And so by doing this sort of logical processing, putting together, again, different observations, different statements, different conditions that you've learned along the way, you're building up your way of, I guess, sort of representing the world, thinking about the world, how to categorize things in different buckets. And then not only are you building up your representation, but you're also building up your skill set to interact with the world and know whether or not something is logically valid or not, right? So that would be introverted thinking. Couple of things that I just want to point out. I mean, a lot of times, a lot of the descriptions that you see about introverted thinking will sort of describe it as subjective thinking. The thinking that is tied to the individual as opposed to the outside world. And that, I think, is, well, first of all, I have a whole other video on this. Feel free to watch it. But it's based off of the fact that when Jung first put these models out there, he talked about things being subjective versus objective, but really when he used those terms, he meant objective is things that are directed towards the outside, and subjective are things that are, your attention or your mental energy is focused on the inside. And so it's subjective in the sense that, it's based off of your logical calculations, your logical determinations that you've made along the way. But yes, you are making determinations and categorizations about things in the outside world, but you're doing it in this very subjective, internal kind of way. So don't be thrown off, I guess, too much by, whether something's objective or subjective. That gets real messy real quick. Just watch the other video and you can see how messy it gets. But think of it, I think, again, the easier way to think about it is, am I engaging in formal logic, right? And another important point that I want to point out is that you can engage in formal logic about things that don't actually exist in the real world, right? So I could make up, a concept like aliens from Pluto, right? As far as I know, they don't exist, and there's a very low chance, very, very low likelihood that, any sort of life could grow on Pluto. So as far as we know, there's no alien life form from Pluto, but I could still give you a logical proposition and say, all aliens from Pluto like tom-toms. And tom-toms is some made-up sort of fruit that you can only, it's like an ice fruit that you can only find on Pluto, right? And so I say all aliens from Pluto like tom-toms, and Mickey is the alien from Pluto, therefore Mickey enjoys tom-toms, right? Validly true, logically true, but it's about symbols, right? It's about representations, about some sort of concept. And there are no actual aliens from Pluto. There are no actual tom-toms fruit from Pluto. But you can still take in that information and come up with a logical conclusion, right? And so that's probably the better way of thinking of subjective versus objective, right? We're not talking about something that actually is out in the real world sometimes. We're just talking about concepts or some sort of symbol that represents a concept, and you're just plugging those symbols into your logic calculator that is somewhere in your brain. And I'll do other videos on where in the brain people think that is. But you have a whole function, you have a whole brain system dedicated to formal logic, and that's what it's doing. And it doesn't necessarily have to be quote unquote objective in the sense that it's about some real object in the outside world. It could be about a mathematical concept or some sort of political or sociological concept that may or may not actually exist, but you can still create sort of a formal logical argument or categorization about it. Okay, so that's introverted thinking in a nutshell. Obviously, there's way more to it and how it interacts with all the other cognitive functions. None of these things work in a vacuum. They all sort of work together. But that's essentially what introverted thinking is doing, taking symbolic logic and creating sort of this knowledge base in a way based off of logical processing, and then also working in real time to figure out whether or not information that's coming in is quote unquote logical. In other words, is it a valid argument given a certain set of conditions, or is it invalid, or could be true but not necessarily true, those sorts of arguments. Okay, so that's it for introverted thinking, and I'm going to move on to the next video.